Hello, the internet. Welcome to Open Source Directions, hosted by OpenTeams, the webinar that brings you all the news about the future of your favorite open source projects. My name is Henry Badgery, and I'm the growth marketer at OpenTeams, and I'll be your host for Open Source Directions. Co-hosting with me today is...
Hi, I'm Madigan, and I'm excited to co-host this episode of Open Source Directions. I'm a postdoc at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I work on a project called YT, and I'm based in Urbana, Illinois.
And I'm Chris. I work at the University of California at Berkeley, and I primarily focus on the Jupyter project and a related project called Binder.
Awesome. Thank you very much. So before we go into the meat of this episode, we have our famous Tweet of the Week section, where each of our panelists presents a tweet that they've been enjoying recently. So Chris, you're up first.
Yeah, so the tweet that I found, probably unsurprising, is related to the recent kind of global concerns around the coronavirus. And I'd noticed that a fellow SciPy PyData contributor, Gael Verhaco, and several of his collaborators as well, recently shared a link to a little web app that they built using, I think, Plotly and scikit-learn and a couple of different pieces of the SciPy ecosystem that visualizes the latest data about what's going on in the world with the COVID outbreak, and even includes some projections and some modeling efforts and things like that. So I thought it was kind of a cool way of seeing the SciPy community coming together and giving their treatment of this.
Awesome. And if you want to find this, the link to the tweets will be in the chat. And Madigan, you're up next.
Okay, so mine is related to animals because we all need a little bit of joy in our lives right now. So maybe some of you have seen the Shed Aquarium has let their penguins walk around because the aquarium is closed. So they're letting them walk around in the general area around the aquarium. And so this particular tweet is a video of a bunch of penguins hopping downstairs, like they're going from one floor to another, and they don't walk downstairs. There's this very adorable plopping noise as they go down. So please enjoy.
Awesome. So yeah, my tweet of the week, which will be posted in the chat. So essentially, Open Source Ventilator Island. There's this movement towards creating a ventilator design and then trying to figure out how we can produce that at a very, very low cost, given the coronavirus and the pandemic that's actually happening at the moment. So I thought this was my tweet of the week because I love the idea that everyone comes together and open source, really, the open source ethos is probably one way that I think we can all collectively come together remotely and work towards really solving this problem. And we all know, I just watched a video that in New York, they're calling for anyone who's basically got a ventilator to donate it and help people out because it's in high demand and there's very little supply considering everything that's happening. So I thought I'd share that. All right, well, now that we're done with the tweet of the week, let's dive a little bit deeper into Jupyter Book. So Jupyter Book is an open source project that lets you build an online book using a collection of Jupyter Notebooks and Markdown files. Its output is similar to the Bookdown tool, and it adds an extra functionality for people running a Jupyter stack. So you can find Jupyter Book on GitHub at github.com/Jupyter/Jupyter-book. It has around 669 stars on GitHub and about 1,932 downloads a month on PyPy. So
Chris, can you tell us, now that we have this nice introduction to Jupyter Book, what was this project? Why was this project started, and what need does it fill?
Yeah, sure. So originally, Jupyter Book was started at UC Berkeley, and we needed it in order to provide open notebook-based learning content for some of the larger classes that we have at the university. So in the last couple of years, Berkeley has revamped a lot of its pedagogy around data science and data analytics, and particularly around introductory data science and data analytics. We wanted to use largely an open source stack that is built on top of Jupyter infrastructure and the kind of broader SciPy PyData community. And we had a lot of content that was written in notebooks, but wanted a way to present it to students in a way that felt a little bit more familiar, a little bit more like a traditional book that they could sort of quickly glance through and browse. So for this reason, we created Jupyter Book as a way to very quickly convert a collection of our notebooks into a static-based HTML site that we could just send a link to students, and then they could quickly look through the content and then grab a notebook if they wanted to really dive deeper into what was inside.
Awesome. Yeah, so it sounds like you've sort of built it and been inspired by other technologies, which are very prevalent in this space. So could you explain a little bit of the history of the name and logo of the project?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that essentially we were trying to think of what would be a good representation of a collection of Jupyter notebooks presented in a more traditional form. And so it seemed like a book was a good way of thinking about that. So if you think about each notebook as an individual page, then a collection of notebooks is a collection of pages, and then you basically have a book.
Awesome.
And it's perfect to make puns about, so that's also great, right?
It's a very punnable name. Yeah.
Yeah, very punny. Are there any alternative projects out there?
Yeah, so as Henry kind of mentioned earlier, there are actually a lot of really great projects out there that aim to help you kind of stitch together collections of content files and then show them as like a holistic unit. Probably the most well-known one is a product that comes from the RStudio community called Bookdown. And this is a really excellent tool in the R community. In many ways, it's kind of, in my opinion, one of the gold standards of creating like computational books. And it definitely inspired a lot of the creation and the design ideas around Jupyter Book, which tries to serve a similar kind of role, but for the Jupyter community and making, building around the Jupyter stack. There are also a couple of really interesting services that people run for hosting collections of notebooks. Probably the earliest one in the Jupyter world is called NB Viewer, which is a service that the Jupyter community has been running for probably like 6 or 7 years. And it just lets you really quickly render a notebook that's hosted on GitHub and then browse it as like a static HTML page. And then a more recent one that I just recently learned about came out of the Fast.ai project and Jeremy Howard. They recently launched a really interesting project. I think it's called Fast Pages, that uses GitHub pages and GitHub actions to quickly allow you to generate a static blog using Jupyter Notebooks on GitHub. And I'm looking forward to checking that one out more too.
Okay, that's awesome. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. One thing that I've noticed last week with PyJanitor, they were inspired by the R community and something that they built. And it seems like you're also inspired by something the R community built too. So it's interesting to see that pattern. But on the topic of that, so what technology is it built on, your project?
Right, so there are 2 different answers to this question, and I can get into more details about the details there later on. But the short version is that the current version of Jupyter Book is largely a combination of 2 things. One of them is a Python API and a little lightweight Python library that uses a project called NBConvert, which can convert Jupyter Notebooks into a collection of other kinds of output formats, in this case HTML. And a project called Jekyll, which is a Ruby-based static website generator that allows you to stitch a collection of HTML pages into a static website. And the current version of Jupyter Book basically just wraps those 2 pieces and then gives people a command line interface that they can use to quickly generate books from their content. However, I say it's a complicated answer because we recently received a grant to work on the Jupyter Book project and a few related tools from the Sloan Foundation. And we're in the middle of rewriting most of the back end of how the Jupyter Book project uses the underlying infrastructure. And in particular, we're going to try to utilize Sphinx, which is another Python project in the documentation stack for Python. And we think that that's going to both allow us to have more high quality content and include things like citations and equations and cross-references, which I'll get into later, as well as standardize our toolkit along some of the other standard tools in the Python ecosystem.
Cool. So can you tell us who started it? You kind of hinted at this a little bit, but I'm very curious.
Yeah, so I think that well, to Henry's point, the inspiration for Jupyter Book has come from lots of different kinds of sources. So in a sense, it was started by a collection of open source projects. Most specifically at UC Berkeley, there's always been kind of a Jupyter team at UC Berkeley that's been part of the Jupyter community more broadly. And we help the university develop tools, deploy those tools, maintain those tools for some of the pedagogical and research use cases at the university. And so we had initially developed Jupyter Book to serve some of the larger data science courses that we have at Berkeley.
That's great to hear, yeah. So I just want to remind listeners too that right now we're talking about Jupyter Book, and in the roadmap discussion, we're going to go more into detail about where you can contribute and how you can contribute. But if you are hearing things that are interesting you, and if you do have any questions, then please post the questions in the right-hand side of the webinar screen. And we'll get to your questions in the Q&A section at the end of the episode. So please ask anything that comes to mind, anything that's interesting you, or anything related to Jupyter Book. Just make sure you list us some questions. So you talked about, so we know who started it. That's great to hear that it came out of a university, and you've really been driving this. Could you tell us who maintains the project?
Yeah, so I think that the most hands-on maintainer over the last, say, year and a half or so, which is about the amount of time the project has been around, has been me as a part of the Jupyter team at Berkeley. We also got a lot of really good help early on from Sam Lau, who was a student at UC Berkeley a year ago, and a woman named Elizabeth Dupre, who's up in Montreal and has also contributed quite a bit. It has now like a broader kind of a relatively small but more diverse community of contributors that just help out here and there. And in the future, as I kind of alluded to earlier, we recently got a grant that is going to partially join together a couple of different Python-based book projects, and hopefully also grow the contributor base of the Jupyter Book project in the process.
Cool. So can you, I'm curious, so like you've talked a little bit about the origins and Jupyter Book kind of starting in academia, and some of the collaborators you've talked about also sound like they're academics. Can you tell us what communities the users and the contributors are from?
Yeah, so I think that originally it was, people who were teaching classes, and that's certainly still a really common user archetype that I see using Jupyter Book. But really, I mean, Jupyter Book it's a communication tool, and it turns out that there are lots of different use cases where people would want to just share collections of notebooks in a way that looks like an online kind of interactive book. And so a lot of people that do, that run data science projects and want to just share their results with other people in a little bit more of a familiar form. People that want to bundle notebooks as a part of like a scientific paper or a research analysis have used Jupyter Book as well. I know a few different publishing pipelines are looking into using it as a part of their publishing tool chains. So I think that's becoming a more diverse group. And just really quickly, one other thing I forgot to mention. So on the Jupyter Book repository on GitHub has these dependency chains that it builds, so it can tell you like what other projects depend on a given project. And actually, if you click on that, you'll basically get a list of all of the different Jupyter books that people are hosting on GitHub. I think it's something like 600 or 700 different books, and it's a good way to just get some inspiration for what are the kinds of things that people are using the tool for.
That's awesome. Yeah, sounds like you really build out a community who's really taken this and grabbed it and taken ownership. And it sounds like the contributor base too has grown a lot recently. So that sort of leads into my next question. Has the project been participating in any diversity and inclusion efforts? Yeah, so I think that Jupyter Book as a sub-project within Jupyter more broadly has certainly been making a lot of inroads into this. Jupyter itself is like a really large, open, and attempts to be inclusive community. And it's done a lot of different work to try and improve these pieces of its community over the past couple of years. It's always a work in progress, and there's definitely still a lot more that the Jupyter community can and will be doing. But we try to, for example, have all of our meetings open to the general public and meeting minutes posted online for those that can't make the time zones that are there. A lot of the teams that I work with, we alternate our team the schedule of our meetings to be more either Asia friendly or America friendly or Europe friendly. We also have a few kind of specific efforts in diversity and inclusion. So we recently applied for one of the CZI Essential Open Source Science grants, the EOSS grants, which we luckily were awarded one. That was with the Jupyter Hub and the Binder projects, which are kind of related to, although not the exact same thing as Jupyter Book. And one of the main goals of that is to be able to pay for time for people to work on the project. And we're going to prioritize that time for people that probably wouldn't be able to contribute otherwise. So right now, that's going to pay for a woman in Romania named Georgiana to do some work on the Littlest Jupyter Hub and the Binder project as well. That's great to hear. Yeah, it's great to see that it seems like you're really participating, and you have a goals and at least a roadmap to be able to expand that and make the contributor base more diverse, which is great to hear. So now we're going to shift into the project demo, where we'll get to see some of the cool features of Jupyter Book and how it works. So while Chris is getting set up, we would like to take this opportunity to thank our sponsor, Quansight, for sponsoring this episode of Open Source Directions. Quansight, creating value from data. So when you're ready, Chris, take it away.
Okay, can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to work from a couple of slides, and then I'm also going to hopefully pop out and do a few demos, and we'll see how that goes. Okay, so I don't really need to do my own introductions anymore, but really quickly I want to point out some of the faces down at the bottom. So in the bottom left is Elizabeth Dupre and Sam Lau, and as I mentioned, both of them did a lot of work on the earlier iterations of Jupyter Book and on the current version of Jupyter Book. And on the bottom right, that's John Starczewski and Greg Caparasso, a PI at ANU in Australia and a PI at Northern Arizona University in the States, respectively. And they are sort of key contributors on the next version of Jupyter Book that I'll talk about a little bit. And so really quickly, just to motivate the reason that this existed in the first place was the general inspiration for how Berkeley's been approaching its courses at the university, which is that they want their data science education to be for everybody at the university. And by that, I mean students who aren't going to be, computer science majors and statistics majors, but also for students who are going to be, philosophy majors and English literature majors and poli-sci majors. Obviously, they don't need all of them to take like a full 4 years worth of statistically rigorous courses, but they want all of them to be familiar with the concepts of data analytics and statistical thinking and whatnot. The challenge is that at Berkeley, it's a large public university, and if you say, oh, we're going to offer like a data science course for literally anyone who wants to come without any background in coding or statistics, you get classrooms like this. So this is the largest well, it's not even really a classroom. This is the Performing Arts Hall at UC Berkeley, and it's full to capacity with students for their introductory Data 8 course, which is a course that utilizes the Jupyter Stack very, very heavily. And so a lot of what we have to do is try and build technology that can facilitate the learning for this very, very large and very, very diverse and heterogeneous student population, some of whom are familiar with coding and Python and whatnot, but many of whom are not. Mm-hmm. And so really the goal of the course is to teach concepts in statistical thinking, give them some experience with interactive computing using entirely open stack, and also to partner with other open projects and open communities in doing so. But what we didn't have the ability to do was to display kind of notebook content in a more familiar or accessible form, particularly for the students that weren't already comfortable with like spinning up their own Jupyter Notebook server and whatnot. And the other thing that we wanted to do was try to strike a balance between like full interactivity with a live Python kernel that you would get in like a Jupyter Notebook or Jupyter Lab versus like a completely static website that you would get if you were just rendering some HTML in like a traditional blogging platform. And so really Jupyter Book is trying to strike that balance between the two of them and give the author the ability to choose how much interactivity they want to bring into the reading experience. Okay, so that brings me to Jupyter Book. And just to repeat the tagline for the 10th time, the goal of Jupyter Book is to allow you to build an online book with Jupyter Books and with Markdown. That down there, that link, that'll send you to the current version of Jupyter Book. It looks like this. Probably the easiest way to describe Jupyter Book is just to show you what a built Jupyter Book looks like. And this is actually a page I can probably just go to on my own. So if you go to inferentialthinking.com, you'll actually see the generated book for that Data 8 class. So all of the material is hosted online. It just exists as a collection of Jupyter Notebooks on GitHub. And really off the bat, the first thing that you'll see is that it doesn't really look that different from what a lot of other websites do. It's got like a left table of contents. It's got a right within page table of contents. But if you look at the content of each page itself, you can see that there was a notebook under the hood that generated all of this stuff. So this page itself is actually in a Jupyter Notebook on GitHub, and it was rendered into this static HTML form with all of the outputs populated and whatnot using Jupyter Book. And so there are some things in here that you can start to play around with, and that give the authors a little bit more control over like what kind of interactivity they want to insert. I don't know that the inferential thinking textbook makes use of this, but I'll show you an example of this later on. But for example, if you want to include PNGs from your book, if you want to use Matplotlib or Seaborn, you can do that. You can also include interactive outputs, things that would normally output like HTML and JavaScript in the Jupyter Notebook. So things like Bokeh or Plotly or Altair, those will also render just fine in Jupyter Book as well. So you can use it to embed interactive content in your books. Okay, so that being said, I want to quickly give a note of warning that there may be some confusion that I'm introducing here, because as I mentioned before, there's a new version of Jupyter Book that's coming out quite soon. And I decided that I think it would be more interesting and potentially more useful to talk about the new version of Jupyter Book as opposed to focusing on the older version of Jupyter Book. That said, the new version of Jupyter Book is still like very much so in an early beta kind of form. So some things might change, some things might be a little bit different than if you just go to jupyterbook.org. But by and large, the experience is pretty much the same. I think that the user-facing workflow for Jupyter Book shouldn't change very much when it moves to the new build system. It'll just be hopefully a new, faster, more feature-full backend that's working under the hood. And I'll go into a little bit of detail about that later. So how do you create a Jupyter Book? Well, in order to build a Jupyter Book, you basically need you need three things. You need a collection of notebooks and markdown files. That's your book content. You need a table of contents file that just defines the structure of your book. And then there's an optional configuration file that just allows you to turn on different kinds of features and things like that. And so just as a little helper, Jupyter Book comes bundled with a create function that basically just creates a little lightweight template book that you can use to build on top of, or that you can just use to see how books are structured so that you can adapt your own content to Jupyter Book. So if you type in at the command line Jupyter Book create my book name, I should say this is after pip installing Jupyter Book. Once you run Jupyter Book create and then give your book a name, it'll generate a collection of files in a new folder for you. And those files are basically the three things that I just mentioned before. So first off, in your config.yaml file, it's just a collection of key value pairs that define things like what's the title of your book, who's the author, do you want to show the sidebar by default or not, do you want to include binder links along with your book content. There's also a table of contents file, and this is the file that actually defines the structure of your book. So the very first entry here is going to be the first page that people land on. You can define subpages for any given page, and then that allows you to kind of nest sections within each self. And then files are just the path to a given either IPyNB file or a markdown file relative to your books folder. And then finally, you just have a collection of content files. As I mentioned before, we want that to either be markdown files or Jupyter Notebook files.
So I have a question for you, Chris, related to this. So when you execute Jupyter Book Create, it sort of creates this cookie cutter template for you that's makes like the start of your book, right? When and then it creates a table of contents for you. How much is in that? Like, is it just these exact files, or does it create like extra chapters and sort of subsections for you?
I will show you in a second.
Oh, great. Okay. Yeah. I'm glad I'm ahead of the curve. Excellent.
Yes. Okay, so once you have like this set of content in a folder, this is really all you need to actually build a book. So when you run Jupyter Book build and you point it to a folder that has that content inside of it, what it does is it collects all of those content files, and then it renders them as a static HTML site that you can then, either deploy online with Netlify or GH Pages, or that you can just browse locally to see how things look. And importantly, you want to make sure that you keep like all of the information that's there in a notebook, like the inputs, the outputs, and eventually you want to also include extra features for publishing, like citations and cross-references and whatnot. So after you build your book, you went from what was originally this collection of configuration and content files, and now we've created a new folder called build, Right now, there will be one output in that folder for HTML, but in the future, there's going to be other kinds of outputs for things like, PDF or EPUB or docx, that kind of thing. But everything that's inside of HTML is just a fully functioning HTML website. Okay, so after having shown you this with a bunch of static information, I'm going to give this a shot to actually show you how it looks. So I've just got a little Jupyter Lab instance running here, and I have an empty folder. And if I do Jupyter, well, JB is sort of a shorthand for Jupyter Book. I'll do the whole thing. Create my cool book. Then it generates a folder, my cool book. And if I look inside that folder, I can see that I basically have exactly the files that I just showed before. There's one extra file that I didn't mention, which is a bibtec file, which I can show some functionality. I'm not going to cover the exact structure of these because I already told you about it before, but this is the configuration file. This is the table of contents file. It's just a lightweight little one that points to these files that are here. And then the content that's inside of these things is just like your regular old content that you would expect to see in a notebook. So here's a regular Jupyter notebook and whatnot. So now if I change into my book folder, and I type Jupyter Book, build, and now it's pointed to the current folder that I'm in, then under the hood, it's actually using Sphinx, as I had mentioned before. Mm-hmm. It collects all of those files, it resolves some stuff about the content that's inside, and then it generates this build folder right here. So if I look inside of the build folder, this is just a functioning static website. And in fact, I can now go to Chrome, build, HTML, and open up my index file, and that will show the Jupyter Book that I just built. Again, it's very bare bones and simple because it's just there to sort of show you how things are meant to look. Just to browse really quickly, if I go to this content with notebooks file, if you remember, this is the notebook that was used under the hood for this file, and this is how it renders on the actual page itself.
It looks good. Awesome.
If you notice, I don't have any outputs here because I haven't run them in this page. If I were to run everything here, now I've got the outputs there. If I rerun Jupyter Book build and then refresh this page, now I've got outputs.
Okay, so it's dependent on whether you execute the notebook before you execute build, what the outputs are going to look like in the HTML, the rendered HTML pages?
It is currently, and that's only because we haven't built in the execution feature yet, but I'll mention it in the future. But yeah, eventually what we're going to do is add in like automatic execution of notebooks that need it, basically.
Okay. So another thing I noticed is on the example book that you showed us on a little bit earlier, there was a link to interact with Binder and also a download link, and this one you just showed only has the download link for the notebook on the HTML that you just showed us. So does Binder only hook up once it is a rendered page on GH Pages or something like that, or is it elsewhere?
No, that's actually a feature that already exists. I just haven't turned it on yet in the command line interface. There's a related project that we're working on that's kind of another one of the under the hood pieces that'll automatically inject those Binder links for you. So that's there as well. But what Madikin's referring to is for any of the pages that have a Jupyter notebook under the hood, if you know the GitHub repository where those notebooks are stored, then you can automatically inject a Binder link to those notebooks, and then you'll be able to use that to immediately send users to like a fully interactive version that's running on a Jupyter server in the cloud with Binder. Yeah.
Awesome.
It's nice that those integrate so easily together as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of the reason for that is that one of the philosophies, the design philosophies of the Jupyter project is to try to design fairly modularly and adopt like common standards and protocols across the different pieces of the project, so that Binder Hub, which is a service that runs something like mybinder.org, also has the ability for other things to hook into it programmatically. So basically, I think, let me see, I'll just show you the current Jupyter Book. Jupyterbook.org has the current version of it. So here you see these interact buttons up here. Mm-hmm. If I'm on a page that's got a notebook under the hood, I've configured this Jupyter Book to say, hey, the collection of notebooks is at this GitHub repository, and the notebooks is at this subfolder in there. And so then Jupyter Book knows how to build up these interact links programmatically and just send me over to a binder instance if I were to click on that. So I'm not going to wait for the binder instance to spin up, but you can kind of see how a reader can really quickly like jump into this interactive version of it if they want to. Okay, so that's like a very quick, like, here's how you go from 0 to a working Jupyter Book in 50 seconds. Should I pause for questions or anything like that, or do you want me to keep on going forward?
You can keep going. We have questions a little bit later in the
okay.
thing.
Okay, cool. So in that case, for the next piece of this, I want to talk about where the Jupyter Book project is moving in the future. A lot of what I just described, some parts of it were this like new build system that I had mentioned, but a lot of it was just the.
I
think Chris just froze.
Frozen. Anyway, I think we could just have a chat until he comes back.
Yep. Hopefully everything is okay. Oh, it might be. You know what? It might be. Yeah, I don't know exactly what happened, but we'll see what happens.
Oh, Chris, you're back. Sorry, we lost you for a second.
I froze.
You froze.
Yeah, you froze like right when you started talking about the executable book project. So if you start over, that would be great.
So the executable book project is a Sloan Foundation funded project. It's a collaboration between 4 different Python-based publishing projects. So IAB is an integrative biology project at Northern Arizona University, headed by Greg Caparasso on the left. QuantEcon is an open textbook for quantitative economics, which is run out of Australia National University, and that's John Sterczewski in the middle, who's the PI on that project. And then Chris Sewell is recently graduated from I think Imperial College London, and he's been running a project called IPyPublish, which tries to bring in more traditional publishing features into the Jupyter ecosystem. And then obviously there's the Jupyter Book project coming out of UC Berkeley. And so the goal of this grant is to basically align the interests and align the stacks of all of these different projects and try to have like a single unified Python stack for publishing, as opposed to each of us having our own separate pieces. And so this is the project that's kind of driving a lot of the new developments that's going to make its way into the next version of Jupyter Book. And you can find just like a meta website for the project at ebp.jupyterbook.org. Stands for Executable Book Project. So really quickly, I want to talk about some of the interesting features that are coming up in the pretty near future, probably the next like month or so, in what I'm just calling Jupyter Book 2.0. So really quickly, just to start off, I wanted to show like the build chain that I'm talking about here. As I showed you before, it was sort of going straight from like static IPyNB and Markdown files into a static website. And that process is largely going to be the same, with hopefully a few extra pieces in the middle. So first off, we still want people to be able to write their content either in Jupyter Notebook files or in Markdown files. But then we want to have a step where they can execute those files and potentially cache their outputs to like a separate cache that Jupyter Book knows how to use. And then we want, when we actually build the site, to be able to draw from that cache if needed, so that we don't need to re-execute the notebooks every single time that we build the site. And that way we know that the outputs that are there are like the latest outputs that should be there, but we don't have to wait for execution every single time we build a book. And that's actually important because projects like QuantEcon, I think they have like many dozens of pages, and it takes something like 2.5 hours to run all of the material for their whole book. And so for some of these larger, more complex projects, we need to have some ability to cache the outputs and check whether or not those outputs are stale before we build the book. And then secondly, once we have all of these built books, we then want to grab some more like rich publishing style information from them. So we want to look for things like cross-references between pages, equation references, citations. We want to pull out all of that rich metadata that's like makes up a proper multi-page document, and then be able to use all of that when we generate the final HTML website. And then finally, once we have that enriched document model, we want to have multiple kinds of outputs. So if you want a static website, like what Jupyter Book currently does, you can do that. If you want to have a PDF that looks really nice and professional and maybe flows through LaTeX, you can have that. I think that people are working on some docx and some EPUB outputs as well. So that's kind of at a high level what the new build process is going to look like. And as I mentioned before, I think one of the goals of the reworking of the backend is to use a little bit more of a modular architecture in the Jupyter and the Python ecosystem. So currently, the 1.0 version of Jupyter Book is basically a single repository on GitHub that does a ton of different kinds of things, right? It does like notebook to HTML conversion, it stitches them all together into a website, it adds all of the bells and whistles around like interactivity and binder links and things like that. What we'd like to do now is build on top of Sphinx, which is a really excellent documentation generator in the Python ecosystem. And basically what we've discovered is that if you want to build like a high quality publication style output, then a lot of the features that you need for that are pretty similar to some of the features that you need for just building high quality technical documentation for your projects. And so our hope is that by using Sphinx, we'll be able to align our stack more closely with the broader Python ecosystem. So rather than largely relying on a tool in the Ruby stack, which many of us don't know as well, and we have less of an ability to contribute, upstream improvements to, we can use Sphinx. We can modularize a lot of the pieces of what Jupyter Book does into Sphinx extensions that the broader Python community can use on their own. And I'll get into some details about that in a second. And hopefully make this project feed into that kind of broader open Python ecosystem as well. So a couple of things that brings to mind then. One of them is, so I mentioned Sphinx here, and for those of you who are familiar with Sphinx, you might have thought, Sphinx doesn't use Markdown, Sphinx uses restructured text, whereas Jupyter Notebooks use Markdown. And that is true. So that was one of our concerns with using Sphinx, is that many authors are just not familiar with writing in restructured text. And so what we decided to do was build a very lightweight flavor of Markdown that is a first-class citizen in the Sphinx ecosystem. We call this something called MIST, or markedly structured text. And basically the goal of MIST is just take Jupyter Notebook Markdown, the same Markdown that we all write in Jupyter, and then add a couple of syntactic pieces to let you use two of the most powerful tools in the Sphinx ecosystem, which are roles and directives. So really quickly, for those of you who aren't familiar, roles and directives, they're kind of like functions, but in Markdown. So a role or a directive can have a name, it can have arguments, it can have keyword, value, option, configuration, and then it can also have content. And this is the general structure of each of those things. So directives are multi-line blocks. Here you have a directive name, you can have arguments, you can configure it, and then you can add your content in there. Roles are inline with the text itself. So you have a role name, and then you just give it some kind of interpreted text. And these are patterns that are quite common in the Sphinx ecosystem that allow you to control different kinds of behavior in your final built HTML website. So an example of each of these things is on the left, this is how you could define like a figure in Jupyter Book. You would say, okay, I'm using the figure directive. I want to point it to a PNG file. And now I want to give it a caption and a label and a name. And then later on in a role, there's a ref role, which allows you to make a cross-reference to another item. So say this is on a different page. I can insert my label here. And because I've defined it over here in this directive, then Sphinx will know how to automatically insert a URL link that cross-references this figure on whatever page is over here.
And then it'll link you back to the page where it's linked properly.
Yeah, exactly.
Nice, nice. That's really cool.
Yeah, that was the reference file that you were showing earlier on.
Yeah, and I can show that up in a little bit if we've got some time for the last section. So let me try showing you what this looks like then. So I'm going to go back to my page here. This is my little mini built site, and I'll edit this Markdown file. So a couple of examples of roles and directives. Let's say that I'm writing some content and then I want to include an extra little piece of information as like a sidebar, sort of like a side note that I don't want to break up my the flow of the main text of the page, but I want to give like a little contextual piece of information to the side. For that, I can use the sidebar directive. So if I do sidebar like that, and then I give it a title, my neat sidebar title, here's my sidebar content, and I close off my directive, then when I rebuild the book, and go to my Markdown page, assuming that my internet works, then I have a little sidebar content down here. And so this is a way that you can sort of control the look and the feel and the structure of your page just by using these little kind of lightweight markup pieces. I can show you, let me see, I think I can show you a citation as well. So if I mentioned before that there's this bibtech file inside the demo book, which right now, because I'm apparently a vain person, I've populated with all of the papers for my PhD thesis. So this is one way to get my my H-index up. So now if I wanted to cite one of those pages, I'm typing some content and now a citation. I can use the cite role and I just pass it the label that's inside that bibtech file. Pretty cool.
Easy.
And now when I rebuild my book, and refresh this, then I'm typing some content, a citation. This links out to the page where the bibliography is inserted right here at the bottom.
Extremely cool. That's so nice.
Makes it easy.
Yeah. So that's like 2 examples of how you can use these little lightweight extra markup syntax to control new kinds of functionality in your page. And the other kind of cool thing about that is that, again, these are kind of like functions, which means that people can extend them in lots of different kinds of ways. And actually, the Sphinx ecosystem has a huge collection of extensions and tools and pieces that are already out there for extending the functionality of Sphinx itself, and thus, by extension, Jupyter Book. For example, that citation syntax that I was using, that uses a Sphinx extension called Sphinx BibTech to allow BibTech style references in your documentation.
Awesome.
That's extremely nice. I just want to say, as somebody who has to deal with citations, that like makes it so much easier.
Right. So I have a couple of extra features to talk about if there's still time.
We've got time, I think, for a few extra features, yes?
Yeah? Okay, cool. Okay, so then a couple of extra things. One of them is, as a part of this process, again, modularizing the stack that's there. We also needed the ability to have like a first-class citizen for rendering notebooks inside of Sphinx. And that's a project that we're calling MistNB. So this is a project that builds on top of the the Mist parser that I mentioned before. And this allows you to basically include Jupyter Notebooks directly into your Sphinx build. So it goes straight from IPyNB into your Sphinx documentation and has all the nice pieces for, including outputs and things like that. And again, that's a tool that both the Mist parser as well as MistNB, those are both completely modular tools that don't inherently know anything about Jupyter Books. So those are tools that anybody can use in the Sphinx ecosystem to either write their documentation purely in Markdown or to write documentation with Jupyter Notebooks and include it in their own open source projects. Another piece of this project is some upstream contributions to a tool called Jupytext. Jupytext is a really interesting 2-way conversion tool between Jupyter Notebooks and various text-based formats. So there is now a Jupytext extension for Mist Markdown. And what that means is that you can go from an IPyNB file here and have a lossless 2-way synchronization between this file and a Markdown representation of that file. So basically, like, code cells become tick, 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 code dash cell, and then you get a kernel name. The one thing that it doesn't transfer over are the outputs, because that would be pretty heinous to try to put into a Markdown file. But I'll get to that in just a second. And then another kind of interesting tool that we've just been playing around with is once you have the ability to represent all of this information in Sphinx, like across multiple pages of your book, then you can start to do some pretty interesting things. So like one pattern that we've seen is that a lot of people, they run their analyses in one notebook, and they'll have this kind of like mega complex notebook with a bunch of different, a bunch of Python or R code inside, tons of different plots, tons of statistics that they're calculating. And then in another notebook or in another Markdown file, they're actually writing the document itself. And so we tried to sort of enable that a little bit more with a little submodule that we called Glue. And what Glue allows you to do is embed snippets of information in a notebook and attach them to a key, so that later on in your book, you can reference that key and insert its value into whatever other page you're working from. And so just a really quick example of what I'm talking about there. So in this figure here, I generated this plot, a bunch of lines, and attached to it is this matplotlib figure object. If I do from mist and b import glue, and then I say glue my cool figure, and then pass it fig, and I'll set display as false. So if display is true, then it'll actually try to display the figure when you glue it, just as like a sanity check. But what I've just done is I've taken this figure and I've attached it to this key name inside the notebook. And now, and let's do another thing here. So I think I have some data up here, right? So I've got data. Let's just calculate the mean of my data. And I'll say, oops, mean equals data mean, and then I'll glue my mean to the variable I just created called mean. So now I've glued two different keys into my notebook, my cool figure and my mean. If I go back into this Markdown file here, then I can do things like this. So use the glue directive and pass it the key that I added in this notebook. So my cool figure. Let's just see what happens there. And let's add some extra stuff to it. My cool figure, and here's a cool caption.
Chris, we just got probably one more minute on this section.
Yep.
So
yeah, so this is done. This is the very end of it here. And here is my statistic, glue, and then my mean. And now if I rebuild the book, uh-oh. Okay. If I rebuild the book, then glue will itself normally, but I'm going to skip this piece because I don't think that we have time to go through it. So anyway, that kind of like gets you, again, this is all like very alpha content. But as I mentioned before, this is sort of like where we're trying to get to with increasing the ability to sort of enrich the relationships between the different pages that are there in your notebooks and in your various content pages. And so the last thing I'll just mention is if you're interested in trying any of this stuff out, then what I recommend is checking out beta.jupyterbook.org. That has like the newer kind of build interface for Jupyter Book. Some of those modular components in Sphinx that I mentioned, the mist parser and mistmb are both at those links. And then if you just want to follow the project at large, at the bottom of the page, those are executable book project generic links as well.
Awesome. Thanks very much for that, Chris. That was really enjoyable. And I wish we had that when I was at university, because I was just staring at boring lecture slides and they were going through them. But it's great to see. So that now that we've discussed about where the project is heading, so that was a roadmap section, we're going to move on to the Q&A section. So Madikin, do you want to kick the first question off?
Yeah, okay. So our first one is from Filippo B. Follow-up to your statement regarding the future interaction between Jupyter Book and Sphinx. Notebooks are mostly Markdown based, while Sphinx is mostly restructured tests. I know that recently Sphinx allows Markdown too. Isn't this adding an additional layer of complexity? And then they have a clarification. Is the EBP going to be Jupyter Book 2.0? Or are they going to be two separate projects? Thank you.
Yeah, so the first one, it definitely is adding a layer of complexity in the sense that there is like, I would say it's more like cognitive complexity on the user's side, because it's another thing for them to think about. The goal of Markdown, the goal of adding Markdown to Sphinx was really trying to stick with the most like common version of Markdown that's out there, which is called Common Mark, which is closer to a community standard than anything else that exists in the Markdown ecosystem. And then just adding like a few extra pieces that are needed to get it working in Sphinx. One of the challenges that we ran into was we wanted to utilize the Sphinx ecosystem, but we found that for a lot of people, writing in restructured text was just like a non-starter. Personally, I read in restructured text a lot and I enjoy it. But especially for a lot of our introductory users, again, a lot of people that are using this stack are like, professors who are not super comfortable with like the deep guts of the Python ecosystem, but they're very familiar writing Markdown because they use GitHub and things like that. So really our goal was to add a few lightweight pieces on the Sphinx ecosystem to allow people to write documentation purely in Markdown. And really like Sphinx itself is meant to be extensible in this way. So.
Uh-oh.
I think we've lost Chris again.
We can pause for a minute. Hopefully he'll come back. But, while we're waiting, if any of you have any more questions, please add them to the thing.
We've just lost Chris. He'll be back.
I'm sure he'll be back. This is going to be good. But thank you for your participation so far, everybody. This has been really great.
It's been an awesome episode. It's been very enjoyable.
Mm-hmm. No cursed coffee.
And Chris is back.
Yay, Chris, you're back. Woo.
So I think that where I was cut off was like in many ways Sphinx is meant to be extensible in this way.
Mm-hmm.
So Sphinx builds in a lot of different hooks so that you can add new kinds of functionality. Restructured text is the markup language that they went with by default, but they very intentionally wanted it to be possible for people to write in other kinds of markup languages. And so that's what the MIST parser is. It's just a parser for Sphinx that's an extension of the Sphinx ecosystem for Markdown. So to answer your second question, basically the executable book project is like a meta project under which it's basically a collaboration that is explicitly attached to this grant. That project will contribute to and build a number of tools in the open source Python ecosystem, MIST-NB, MIST parser, Sphinx, but also just upstreaming a lot of pieces to like Jupytext, the Jupyter ecosystem, and whatnot. Jupyter Book will, I think, be a more kind of controller process over these different pieces. And I think that eventually the executable book project will dissolve because the grant will run out. And at some point in the next 6 months or so, the grant goes for another 3 years, but at some point in the next 6 months or so, we're going to pivot more of our effort towards like building out the open source communities around these projects, upstreaming as many contributions as we can to other projects in the Jupyter and the Python and the Sphinx ecosystem, and trying to build a more proper, like sustainable open source community around them.
Awesome.
That's super nice. Yeah. We have one more question in the question box from Sophia Yang. Can I use Jupytext with Jupyter Book so that my content files would be .py files instead of IPython notebook files?
Yes, yeah. It's not in there yet in the new version, but eventually, yeah, what we want is for anything that is like a valid Jupytext input should also work with Jupyter Book. I think that the MIST Markdown flavor of Jupytext will be treated in some kind of special way, probably for the purposes of caching the outputs and storing them for later on, so that when you rebuild a book, it'll first check and say, okay, which pages have you edited, and in those pages did you edit any of the code? If not, then I don't need to rerun all of the code. I can just use the cached outputs. But if so, I need to re-execute it. I think some of that logic might be like Jupyter Notebook or MIST Notebook specific, but in general, yeah, we want to support anything that Jupytext will support.
Awesome. Well, great. Thank you for that. And thank you very much for your questions, everyone listening. It's been great. So now it's time for our famous rant and rave section, where we all get 15 seconds to either rant or rave about whatever topic we want. So Chris, it's your soapbox.
Yeah, so I think that for me, the thing that I wanted to rave about is, I guess, in a sense, also related to coronavirus. But because we're all working from home, and for example, you all can see my lovely room behind me, I think one of the things that I've really enjoyed about this is that you get a different kind of perspective into people's lives than you normally do when you're just meeting them in conference rooms and whatnot. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I particularly enjoyed is watching the number of dogs, cats, and children that decide to come in and like start pawing at their parents' faces in the middle of Zoom chats and Skype meetings and whatnot. I don't know why, but I think that I find it like a nice kind of way to personalize what is a difficult situation for a lot of people, and working from home, not seeing a lot of other people, and it brings me a little bit of happiness to get those little interruptions, whether they're wanted or not on the other end. I don't know, but I enjoy them.
Awesome, thank you. And Medigan, how about you?
Okay, well, I'd like to rave about libraries and librarians. I think right now we all are thinking about ways to get the content we want while we're at home, and there's a lot of really great resources going around that libraries offer that are not in person, so you don't just have to get books in person. There's lots of really good apps where you can download books, but you can also download things like comic books or audio books, and libraries are like collecting a lot of resources related to that. So I'd like to thank all of our librarians. They're amazing, and thank you for being great.
Awesome, thank you very much. Chris, is sort of in line with you, but I have a bit of a rant, and it's more a hypothesis now that everyone's working from home. I look at Snapchat, I look at social media, and everyone seems to be more healthy and really enjoying working from home. So I just wanted to rant by the fact that I think there's going to be a bit of an uprising in a lot of companies where people are going to demand now that they work from home. So that's my little rant. But yeah, thank you very much. That's all we have time for today. Thanks for watching and thanks for listening. You can find us on Twitter at OpenTeams and at QuantSiteAI. So if you're interested in also funding open source projects, including Jupyter Book, you can find all the project roadmaps at quantsite.com/projects. Chris, so where can people find you in Jupyter Book?
Yeah, so me personally, I'm just at choldgraph on Twitter as well as on GitHub. I spend a lot of my time there, as well as in the Jupyter community forum at discourse.jupyter.org. The Jupyter Book project, I shared a couple of links before and can include those in whatever materials we follow up with on this webcast. But jupyterbook.org for the current version of Jupyter Book, beta.jupyterbook.org for the new version of it. And then github.com/executable book project is just the place where we are like managing the process of the project itself, and you can kind of keep up to date with some of the movement there if you're interested in following along or contributing as well.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Thank you for your time, and thanks everyone for listening. Join us again next episode for a pointed discussion on Apache Arrow.
All right. Thanks very much.